Next, we have the Every Student Succeeds Act Plan, Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman. Thank you. This is Deputy Superintendent. Oh my goodness! Wow. Let's just be clear. That is not even an. Oh, good. Just keep going. This is Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman over student achievement, and we have our team here in addressing the concerns for ESSA, and we're addressing the 3 concerns that the Department of Education sent back to us in regards to the Every Student Succeeds Act and our plan that went along with it. So. First of all, the first one that we're going to be going over, I think on there is there's 3 of them, the waiver, and that is for our 95% opt-out rate. The second one being our equitable distribution of effective teachers, and then we also are going over the accountability system in our alternative schools. The one thing that I wanted to start out with in prefacing this entire conversation is sometimes we get asked to do things because we have to do them, and sometimes we look at something and we think we've done a really good job, and then you take a second look at it and think, having taken a second look at it, things are now better. And that actually happened in some of our committee meetings in looking at what we were asked to do, especially in the area of the alternative education, and bringing in that group of stakeholders and getting the feedback from the group and really seeing that they wanted to be counted and they wanted to have calculations because they mattered, and then seeing what came of that. I think that these recommendations are in a good place, and let's go ahead and start with that.
What slide do you want me to be on?
Yeah, this one.
Okay. Good morning, Assistant Superintendent Leah Voorhees. So I was asked to get a committee together to review the request related to how we include alternative schools in the accountability system. So we had a committee of about a dozen people, including Anne Michelle, our accountability specialist here at the state board, our YIC specialist, Aaron Bruff, our data and statistics coordinator, Tanya Semerad, who is our students with significant cognitive disabilities specialist, Tammy Gear, who's the data specialist in special education, and 2 district representatives, the principal of the Alternative High School in Davis School District and the principal of the Alternative High School in Ogden School District, Kathleen Chronister and Benji Carrier. So we had a very good cross-section of individuals. I'm Brian Olmstead, the coordinator, executive coordinator in SAS, excuse me. So we met 3 times, and in order to provide you with quick and useful information, we determined the scope of what we wanted to present to you would be to take the current accountability system for alternative schools and propose how we would include those currently identified alternative schools in accountability for purposes of ESSA. There are basically 2 premises, okay, to the approach that we would like to propose to you. The first is that all schools will be included in the accountability system. So basic principle required by ESSA and one of your imperatives related to equity. And then the second proposal is really the work that we did in this committee. We looked at what other states had done, and then we looked at the current accountability system. And several of the members of our committee had participated on the committee that created the current accountability system for alternative schools. So they had history to bring to the table. And where we fell was that all schools would be included in the accountability system the same way. If they had indicators, if they had data for indicators, that data would be counted, a score would be created, all schools would be ranked according to how the percentage of points that they received for accountability. And if the schools currently identified as alternative ended up in the bottom 5%, the schools that we would be identified if they're Title I for school improvement, and then the bottom 3% for the schools, whether they're Title I or not, that we would be identified for school improvement, then we would do a secondary analysis of their data. So as the second bullet says, if they were identified as falling in the bottom 5%, then some schools, these schools that are considered alternative, would be given a second review. So that could include schools that are currently designated as serving special populations and schools that do not meet the minimum N size requirements in our accountability system. So in the first tier of accountability, in which they would be included, they wouldn't get points in many of the indicators because their N size is too small, okay? So this is our proposal, just visually. It says the same thing as the previous slide, but there'd be standard accountability, schools that were designated as an alternative and fell in the bottom 5% would have a second analysis. This is what the second analysis would be based on. These are the priorities for analysis that our committee came up with. Next slide, please. So first of all, the indicators would provide information on how these schools are meeting the individualized needs of students and the school community. So one thing that our committee talked about extensively and we all had consensus on very quickly is that we need to consider the purpose of the school. What does this school bring to our public education system? Okay, the indicators would capture the variety of purposes that these schools bring to our public education system. The indicators would support and incentivize schools to implement best practices for the students that they serve, okay, and would give recognition to the fact that these schools are unique. They have special purpose. They provide additional information to add to the standard accountability system, and that those indicators would actually meaningfully differentiate between the schools. So that it would make a difference that we did the calculation. There would be some room for analysis. Okay, so next slide, please.
We have one question.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Board Member Cummins.
Deputy Voorhees, could you go back to the alternative schools will be given a second review slide? I'm concerned that on the panel there was not representation of charters or those schools that have provided a second or another choice for parents as far as what they're to be taught. It seems like we're putting schools that have a round philosophy into a square peg. And we are judging those schools based on the square peg rules. And therefore, we are setting them up to fail and then judging them by our philosophies and then making sure that they're in the turnaround and making sure they comply and basically go against everything that they started out for. I'm concerned that we're not broadening our scope. When you come down to identification for school improvement turnaround, are you looking at other factors, including ACT scores? Are you looking at other factors of what is making that school succeed?
We are, and I need to apologize twice, first of all.
Okay.
Because I need to apologize to all of you. I forgot Jennifer Lambert from Charter Schools was on the committee.
Okay.
And to her for forgetting her. I was walking around the table in my head of our last meeting and naming all the people at the table and missed Jennifer Lambert. So we did have a representative from Charter Schools.
Okay.
And to your very important point, the point that the committee came to, in fact, is we do need to honor the purpose of these schools. And so the indicators need to honor the purpose of these schools. So I'm
Yes.
going to demonstrate, I'm going to show you the indicators that the group came to consensus on that will very clearly give those schools the ability to show us what they're good at.
Okay, because otherwise, if we don't, then and I'm going to request this anyway, but at some point when it's appropriate, I'm going to request that a waiver process be given at the state level for LEAs to opt out of the accountability measure. And and that has been shown to me in the ESSA law so that we can do that at the state level. And so that's a process that I'm going to request if we don't start looking at and making sure that we're not labeling schools as a failure inappropriately.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carrie.
Continue? Thank you. Okay, so here are the indicators based on the priorities that I just went through. So what we're looking at is basically four indicators that would each have points attached, and schools would receive a percentage of the points based on their individual choices and their student population. So the first construct is attendance. Attendance would have two pieces: the rate of attendance, and then also the improvement in attendance at the school. So one of the primary purposes of alternative schools is to give students the opportunity to receive instruction in a way that better fits their needs. And to receive that instruction, they need to attend. So one of the great things that alternative schools bring to our public education system is they're able to get students to come to school that sometimes they wouldn't have gone in previous situations. So, and that attendance is an indicator in our current system of accountability for alternative schools, but we have divided it out into both the rate and improvement to be able to incentivize alternative schools who are really working on getting kids into instruction. Okay, so the second construct is credit. Many of these schools, the N size is too low.
Sorry to interrupt. So
Please.
when we talk about attendance, and I just want to bring that, I think it connects to what Board Member Cummins was speaking to. Some of these schools may or may not be brick and mortar as well, so it would be
True.
I mean,
Yeah, so attendance to instruction, not necessarily showing up, but being available for instruction. Thank you for the clarification. So then the second indicator is credit. So many of these schools, their N size is too low to receive a growth score from SAGE. But they, as Deputy Superintendent Norman said, they want to be able to demonstrate that students make progress as a result of attending an alternative school. And so our committee proposal is to divide the construct of credit into two parts: the credit that is earned, and then advanced coursework based on your strategic plan and the metrics in your strategic plan, advanced coursework that is earned, specifically including CTE credit, as that's very important to the purpose of many of these alternative schools. And the third indicator we have titled transition. This would be an indicator in which the schools could choose, which speaks to Board Member Cummins' question. The schools could choose one of these items or a couple of these items as to be able to provide the points based on the purpose of their school. So some alternative schools, the purpose of their school is to get students to graduate. That isn't the purpose of all alternative schools, especially many of our youth in custody schools. Their purpose is to give kids the skills and the opportunities and the experiences they need to be able to move into a less restrictive environment. So the student may be there a much shorter time, and graduation isn't the goal. It's the ultimate goal, but for the time that the student is with them, graduation isn't the goal. It's to be able to move the student into a less restrictive environment. So we wanted to honor that purpose. So then the schools could choose, based on their purpose, which of those indicators would feed to the construct of transition. And lastly, the last indicator would be an incentive indicator. The schools could choose, based on the current accountability system and our ESSA plan for all schools, that they have the opportunity to provide self-reported indicators. These schools would as well, and the two self-reported indicators that the committee felt were most important are that the school administers a school climate survey and analyzes the results of that school climate survey, and then that the school analyzes local assessment data. And so the schools would be required to submit that analysis and would receive a flat number of points for the submission, which would incentivize going through the process. There is an asterisk there, and the reason is what the schools would really love is to be able to have a pre-post assessment that they give students for the amount of time that the students spend with them, so they could really demonstrate the progress that the students make. The assessment that they would all prefer is the test of adult basic education, called the TABE. A couple of alternative schools do use it. They do it paper pencil because they can't afford to do it online. They would love to do it online. Some of our schools can't afford to do it at all. And so they would love for that or a test similar to it to be available to all alternative schools, so they could really demonstrate and show the state that students make progress as a result of attending an alternative school, and that the alternative schools bring value to our public education system.
Okay, just one moment. Vice Chair Ellis?
Thank you, and thank you for taking the time and coming up with some of these solutions. So I have two questions. One is, and I apologize if you said this and it missed my brain, but are we going to be defining what it is to be an alternative school? Because a lot of the charters that I hear coming to the charter board every month wouldn't necessarily be defined as a charter board, but they have like 56% opt-out rate and other things that the current system isn't really doing them justice. And also I know of a school, and I apologize for not having all of the terminology at the tip of my tongue, and I believe it was servicing a population of English language learning students, and they had just received an accolade for performing and showing performance on a test geared towards just the acquisition of that skill, and yet are performing low on SAGE scores. And so the self-reported indicators, is that where something like that would lie? Because they weren't somewhere where it was in a transition stage, because it was younger students.
So awesome question. Thank you for asking it. So in the standard accountability system, which all schools will first be applied to the standard accountability system, all schools have the ability to report results on a self-reported indicator. So that school would have the ability to report it in the first tier of analysis. And yeah, so.
Well, sorry, so
Yeah,
you're
you're
saying that happens right now? Because for turnaround schools, right now my understanding is there's only the one indicator that we are allowable to use. We're allowed to identify different indicators, but we've only been using one indicator to identify the schools that would be put into turnaround status. And so I don't know that that's really currently happening. And so I'm not sure if I understand your explanation that that's currently in this system, because.
So that's the proposal.
Okay, thank you. Yes, thank you.
Did that, and but your first question, the definition.
Yes, please.
Okay, so this committee, because of the time frame in which we had to bring you this proposal, one of the committee's recommendations is that we continue to work on a definition of alternative schools. But for for the scope of this proposal, we are including the alternative schools currently indicated in our accountability system. But we definitely want to tackle the definition issue, but for the scope of the time frame that we had to bring you this information, that was not possible at this time. But we want to continue and go there.
Yes, Board Member Wright?
Is there any chance that maybe schools could decide for themselves essentially whether they're alternative schools? And so there's kind of a simple thing and they can decide, because
What?
I'm afraid it could just take enormous amount of time and resources and endless contention if we're trying to decide.
Go ahead.
In our Standards and Assessment Committee, there's a work group that is currently on there, and this is answering one of the questions. And so in the larger work group, there's other questions that were asked by the Standards and Assessment Committee to address in defining what alternative schools were, purpose. It's much broader than that. And so that work group, we anticipate will go much longer and more in depth than just answering this first question. So that would be one of the questions that, you know, in working this through, what are those questions that we need to answer in that work group?
Board Member Belknap?
Thank you, Chair. I've been writing my questions down. I still struggle, and Vice Chair Ellis and I have discussed this a lot, what really denotes an alternative school. But I think my rub with this is, what about the schools that aren't? We have 27 schools noted as alternative schools in the state of Utah right now. What about those schools who should get a second look, but they're not noted as an alternative school? They fit every parameter. What happens to them? They fall through the cracks, but one that's been noted under an awkward and an undetermined system is alternative?
So I think that's what Deputy Superintendent is speaking to, the fact that we really need to work through the definition of alternative schools. So then, like Board Member Wright is asking, they could request the ability to participate.
So currently we have, I apologize. Currently, we have something that has to be done quickly, and we have things that are currently happening. So currently we have schools that are designated as alternative schools. With those schools that are designated as alternative schools currently, this is what we can do. And then in working this forward in, I don't know if we want to go back to, to me it's two filters. We have the first filter, and then with the first filter, if they don't get an accountability score, then we have the second filter that could be put in place to be able to say, are you really then in turnaround? And it's really talking about that, those equity dollars and designating those schools as turnaround for the purpose of ESSA right now. So that's what we're talking about, is the funding source for our students. And so with that, if we don't have that second filter right now, then we may be determining that schools are in turnaround that may not necessarily need that money for that population of students. So that's our first question that we're trying to solve right now. The second question we're trying to solve are the questions that you're asking, and they're amazing questions, and they're the questions that are going to take some time, research, energy, and a lot of communication with various stakeholders. And so we would love to have even more conversation about these further questions and write them down, getting them to Assistant Superintendent Leah Voorhees, and so that she can actually ask those in that group.
Yes, go ahead, Board Member Belknap.
I think my most important question got washed by trying to figure out what an alternative school is. But what do we do with schools who aren't labeled as alternative now, but they fit every parameter? Do they get a second look, or are they stuck in the first tier?
I think that's a question that we're asking right now. As a
Okay.
board, that's what we're
Okay.
talking about. The committee and what they came up with is those that are designated currently as alternative schools, for them to get that second look. There's another way of going through that, which Assistant Superintendent Leah Voorhees talked about, which is having all schools go through that. Would you like to talk about that the committee talked about as well? So,
I'm not sure what
all
you're
right.
talking about.
Can I ask a clarifying question then, based on Board Member Belknap's question, is what's the timeline on implementation of this? So if we approve this particular route for our ESSA plan, would this go into effect in our next school grading cycle or our next time that we identify turnaround schools. And so what's the time frame on it?
Yes, thank you.
So what
Sorry.
school year
Sorry.
would that be?
Yes. Okay. Yes, it would go into effect the next cycle. Thank you.
Okay, so as we go through the work of, so when we go forward with this, understanding that the work of defining alternative school would be very important to accomplish prior to that next fall deadline.
Anne Michelle Neal, Accountability Specialist here at USB.
Oh, go ahead, please. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes, the hope is to roll the system out in alignment with the revised accountability system that goes into place this coming fall. To speak to your question also, I think this process identifies any school for which an overall score can't be calculated. So any school, regardless of alternative status or not, will be flagged as having missing indicators from the standard system. So it's going to capture a wide variety of schools. And this second review process will apply. I think our work group plan is that it will apply for all schools. That we may need to define indicators a little differently. That's something we're excited to figure out. But this is specifically a plan for alternative schools, but any school that doesn't have an overall score will be able to follow this same process regardless of their type identification.
Board Member Cummins.
Will there be a process also for those schools who do not get identified or get missed as an alternative school? Is there a challenge process of identification? Is there an appeal process? Yes.
Our committee didn't actually discuss an appeal process. If that is a question you'd like to have us put back on the continuing committee agenda, we can certainly do that. We
Yes,
did not
thank you.
discuss one.
Okay.
Board Member Beebe.
The designation of an alternative school kind of concerns me, and I really hope that there is very strict boundaries to it. I work in a school currently that has an alternative population, and sometimes when we decide that we're going to call them an alternative school, we lower our standards or change our standards, and to diminish their need for an education and to be relevant and to be on par with their peers concerns me. I too frequently see that all alternative schools decide that these are reasons or excuses that they shouldn't be succeeding at the highest level. And so I'm very cautious about this, and it concerns me. Even students that I've worked with that have tremendous struggles, for me to say that they don't have to meet my standards that everybody else has to meet in the school concerns me. To measure them by a shorter stick concerns me. I think that we should have high expectations for every student. And if they have these risk factors that cause them not to come to school, I think we should help them more instead of lower their standards. So I'm really concerned about this alternative school numbers, designation, and how we're going to hold them accountable and us accountable to make sure that every student succeeds.
Board Member
I just
Gravitt.
wanted to respond to that and say that my sense is that we are holding them accountable, but we're also recognizing there's a differentiation, that maybe there's a different purpose, because I just think that we say not everybody is alike, and perhaps your purpose is different, because I think the intent is high standards. That's what I see it as, and I really like the work of this. I like the way this looks. I think it's a good thing.
Board Member Ellis, or Vice Chair Ellis, did you have something?
Thank you. I was going
Your microphone.
Thought I turned it on. I turned it off. I was going to make a similar point. It's how you define success, and the goals are different, and each student is individual. And I think we need to remember that as state board members, that when we try to fit everybody on the same path and say this is what it looks like to be successful, when their goals may be different or their path in life is different, success is going to look different. And it doesn't mean that one path is better than the other, or anyway, so that's basically all I had to say. Thank you.
Associate Superintendent Nielsen.
In addressing Board Member Reeby's concerns, it's something we think a lot about too. And this, I think, is an example of how we're taking a step forward. In the previous accountability systems, the alternative schools, which again, we don't have a definition for, but X number of schools weren't filtered through the accountability system at all. They had a separate system. So back to this graphic, the fact that now every school will be run through the traditional, if that's the right term for it or not, accountability system first, and then we'll take a closer look at those schools who aren't able to generate a score for some reason, one of their indicators or multiple indicators aren't there. So I think this is a step forward in trying to address the concerns that we share on making sure schools aren't invisible, and that students, that we don't handicap our students because we don't hold them to the expectations that they're capable of.
Okay, I think that's the questions if you want to carry on with your presentation.
Thank you. So the next slide, yeah, here we go. This is just a visual of the previous slide. So this is the 4 indicators and the percentage of points that we would propose to ascribe to each of those constructs. So the next slide demonstrates.
Vice Chair Ellis.
I apologize, but that graphic made me, I was wondering how you were weighting those, and this visually showed me. And I'm concerned about the self-reported indicators being such a small percentage, especially when some schools may be in a phase where they aren't at a transition phase yet. They aren't there where they're going to be able to show something after the fact as successful. And anyway, so I'm thinking specifically of that school that I was mentioning earlier with that they got a state achievement for their results on this one test, and then we tell them they're failing when they were showing performance. And it seems like that there needs to be a way where that can be more heavily influenced depending on the situation of the individual school. Anyways, that's just my comment on that, about the weight of each individual thing you're looking at.
Yeah, and I respond quickly. Thank you. And we agreed and talked quite a bit about that. Those self-reported indicators currently, in the previous slide, the way they would be accounted for is a flat number of points. It's kind of a yes/no, because at present, schools don't always have the ability to, and not all the schools have the ability to like the local assessment data, not all the schools have a test for which we could then give them a percentage of points. And so that's why we're trying to incentivize the analysis of what it is that they're doing, both the climate and the assessment. But we did discuss your concern. Continue. Okay, so this graphic here demonstrates the schools in the current accountability system in the blue grayish, and then in the green, or excuse me, in the green, the way they would be held accountable in our current accountability system, and in the blue grayish color, how they would be held accountable if we implemented the proposal. And so you can see that in the green, there are many more schools that end up with a larger percentage of the points. The current system does not differentiate as well as the proposal system does. So if we can go to the next slide, you can actually see a statistical analysis of the differentiation. So you can see that we have a sort of normal curve in the distribution on the left, much closer to normal curve in the distribution in the left. In the proposed system, we have more schools that are receiving ranks that aren't all up in the very top. Under the current accountability system, almost all the schools designated as alternative would receive the the highest ranking. None of them would be given any support, to speak to Board Member Reeby's point about providing support if they need support. None of them would be receiving any support because the current accountability system, they are all receiving the majority of the points. In the proposed accountability system, there's a more normal distribution. You can see that it's still skewed. It's not, the center of the distribution is not at the 50% line, but that the distribution is more normal and it differentiates better. So in the last slide, we have written some proposed language to submit that is very broad, but that would allow you to be able to implement a system like the proposed system, and would satisfy the requirement that all schools are considered in the accountability system.
Board Member Belknap?
Thank you. Lee, will you go back one slide, please?
Yes.
Okay, so my question is, let's say ESSA, this whole plan drops today, fails, whatever. And are you proposing this change for our state even if it doesn't go through? Because it makes more sense to provide that.
Our committee would propose that, yes.
Okay, thank you.
And we would propose to continue to work on it.
Okay. Okay, that concludes that portion of the demonstration. Okay, you guys are welcome to move on to the next item.
Yes, please.
So the section of the responses that I worked on with the team is the equitable distribution of effective educators. We had a smaller team because we had a smaller lift than what Assistant Superintendent Voorhees has just described to you. We had on our committee, we had Travis Rawlings, the coordinator from licensing. We had Kristen Campbell, who is our data steward. We had Jeannie Rowland, who is over the coordinator over educator effectiveness. We had Momi Tua, who works in SAS. We had Danelle, I don't know how to say her last name. Thank you, from the Access Committee, and we also had Heidi Matthews from UEA. We met one time for an afternoon, and during that time really felt like we had hammered out the necessary responses. So the first thing that what the Department of Education responded to us is that we did not address disproportionate rates of access to effective teachers for low-income and minority children. The data that we had presented in our ESSA plan previously was really about inexperienced teachers, and we didn't have the effectiveness data at the time that we wrote our equity plan, and so we failed to actually put this in. So we had Kristen Campbell pull the data, and what we found is that fewer than 25 teachers statewide were rated ineffective last year from the districts that we collected from, and an extrapolation of what we thought would be true in charter schools. So with fewer than 25 statewide and no more than 4 in any one LEA, there's no way we can make it any kind of a case for any sort of inequitable distribution. So our proposed response is just exactly that, to say that we looked at the data of the ineffective teachers and we don't have enough ineffective teachers to distribute them at all. And then also to acknowledge in our plan that should that change, we would address it in the future, and that we might want to do some work because it's a little bit surprising to everybody that there would be fewer than 25 teachers that are ineffective in the entire state. We're having a little bit of trouble with the data, but that is the only data that we have. So that is our first piece of proposed response.
Okay, do you want to pause just one second? Board Member Reeby, do you have a question?
Yeah. That's very exciting that we don't have ineffective teachers in our schools. That makes me relieved. But I am concerned that the turnover in our low-income schools is so high, and I'm concerned that we get our newest teachers. And although I'm not proposing that our new teachers are ineffective, they definitely don't have as many tools in their toolbox. So was that addressed, the turnover and the rate of new teachers in our lowest income schools? Because I think that is very problematic.
So that was addressed in our original ESSA plan. So the feedback was only on the pieces of the ESSA plan that needed to be revised. And since we already addressed the inexperienced and out-of-field teachers in the original ESSA plan, we did not address that again because it's already there. Okay, so for the second piece of response was that I've got to find my right place here. ESSA requires a state to describe the extent, if any, that low-income children enrolled in schools under Title I are served at disproportionate rates. And one of the issues that we found as we were looking at the data is we have no data for charter schools because charter schools are exempt from the from having to use our evaluation system, although they are required to have their own, they have not reported. So our proposed response, and this is the piece that is that I think is most actionable by you, is that the board would adopt rules that would require charter schools to report the numbers of ineffective teachers by using probably the same 4-point rating system. So they wouldn't have to change their evaluation systems. It would just be a matter of requiring reporting to us so that we can actually verify the numbers. Because that number 25 that I told you, that was just based on looking at districts and saying if it's the same in charter schools as it is in districts, then it's less than 25 statewide. And we actually don't know that for a fact. And so our proposal here is that you would adopt a rule that would require them to report their numbers of ineffective teachers. And the third, I'm sorry.
Board Member Reby?
So currently, our districts are required to report ineffective students and report the evaluations.
Teachers,
And
yes.
charter schools have different rules that don't require them to report their evaluations of their teachers.
That is correct. The charter schools have their own systems. They don't even need to use our system. So they might not have a 4-point rating scale. They might have a 3-point rating scale, or they might be using they would still be using the effective educator standards, but they might treat those components in a different way. None of that would be affected by that. They would still be doing their evaluations, but they would just have to report. Currently, they do not report.
So if every district is using different tools, how are we going to, are they going to have the same tool, or are they going to have the same rubric?
So they would not be required to. I mean, that would be something, an alternate way that you could go if you chose, is you could ask the legislature to make charter schools comply with the elements of statute that are affected by this. That didn't seem like a direction that the committee either felt or thought that you would really be warm to. That is another alternative. The way statute is right now, they do not have to comply. And so basically, we would be accepting their definition of an ineffective teacher.
So I just want to clarify a point, if I may. So while charters are exempt from our evaluation system, by virtue of their charter, every charter has an educator evaluation. So I just didn't want anyone in the audience to think that they don't evaluate teachers. They're just exempt from that reporting.
Okay. We'll go to Board Member Lear and then back to Board Member Reby.
And mine's a direct follow-up to Sid's point. Have we done any research or review or anything to know if charter schools, all 130 of them, have an evaluation system, though the law says that the law says their charters are supposed to provide for that? Do we know if they do?
That is not something that we monitor. We know anecdotally that many of them do, just in our relationships with charter schools. And we also know that many of them actually use our tool in our system. But they're not required to, and we have not monitored that, so I can't answer.
So we don't have any, just to follow up, please. So we don't have any real data to know what kind of systems they have. They're not required to submit that system. We don't know what kind of systems they have or if they're actively even using a system.
You're correct.
Thanks.
Yes, Board Member Reby?
When you say that we had 25 ineffective teachers in our, and you said that you assumed that the charter schools, you kind of like, do our charter schools have the same rates of masters? Do they have the same rates as bachelors? Do they have the same rates as licensing as our district schools, because if they have different rates of that, then the assumption that they have the same type of experiences is not really accurate. So are those measures the same from our charters to our districts?
So we didn't look at degrees. We actually talked about using degrees as a proxy for ineffective and decided that that was not an appropriate proxy. We do know that charter schools, and this is in our equitable distribution plan, we do know that charter schools have much higher rates of inexperienced and out-of-field teachers. So that part of it we know. Just so you know where the numbers are, it's actually, we have 14 identified ineffective teachers in the state through the districts. And so that's where the 25, that's the extrapolation. But we had to make that assumption to have a number, but so that we could put that in the plan, but we do not assume that it's actually at the same rate.
Okay, continue. Thank you.
Okay. And the third thing that they asked really was just a lack of clarity on our part in our original writing. So they said it is unclear whether USBE meets the statutory requirement to publicly report how low-income and minority children are not served at disproportionate rates by ineffective, out-of-field, and inexperienced teachers. And so our proposed response here is basically to lift the language that was in the equitable distribution plan that we submitted that was approved, and then just put that into the ESSA plan for clarity. So it's not doing anything that we haven't already said we would do. It's just clarifying that, yes, we intend to include this data as part of the state report card and the report card for each LEA, and that would be available on the data gateway.
Okay, are there any more board member questions on this topic? Okay, then we'll move to the next item.
Assistant Superintendent of Student Learning, Darren Nielsen. And it's my pleasure to be here with you today to talk about this challenge facing the board. Tiffany Stanley brought this presentation to you in January, and I'm going to review a couple of these slides just to reframe the problem that we're talking about in terms of the 95% participation. Before I do, though, so I was listening to Leah talk about the desire for the alternative schools and the work group that she worked with to make sure that none of those schools were invisible. That phrase caught my attention. 95% rule really talks about making sure no students are invisible. Okay, so just to kind of, that's the umbrella that we're talking about, is making sure students individually aren't invisible to the accountability system. So what is the crux of the problem is that we have a state law that is in conflict with one of the statutes or the provisions of our ESSA. And the state law that's in conflict is the one that requires that the board make rules that prevent a negative impact on an LEA as a result of state accountability or statewide assessment. The ESSA law then that conflicts with that to some degree is their requirement, or again their desire to make sure students aren't invisible, and so they require that schools have 95% or more of their students participate in the accountability assessments, and if that measure is not met, the students who fall below that, instead of us being able to include their known proficiency rate because it's unknown, they haven't tested, we count them as non-proficient. So this is just another way of saying that that's a little clearer, I think, in my mind. Non-tested students are counted as non-proficient, whereas we don't know that. We just have to apply that rule in the calculation measures. So a couple of slides again, and we'll go fairly quickly through these. These are just examples. A sample school, if we have a school with 120 kids, we test 100 of those, so we have 20 students, which would equal 17% of their population that are not tested. We are not identifying the reason they aren't tested here. They're just not tested, and there could be multiple reasons for that. Our current methodology then would show that we take the 65 students that tested, or out of the 100 students that tested, we have 65% of them proficient, so our proficiency rate would be 65%. Using the ESSA methodology, that 65% drops to 57%, and that's the measure that's used for school accountability. So they take below the 95% to 114, and then those students, again, that didn't test are considered non-proficient, which is kind of the crux of our problem. So Tiffany presented 3 approaches when she came to the board in January, and then the board requested that we talk about one of those approaches. And so the bulk of my slides are going to be focusing on this approach number 1, and that's as a request of the board in January. So I'm going to put these up. So approach number 2 is the one that is the most compliant, I guess would be the word, with ESSA, is that we just have 2 accountability measures. We provide a score on the federal accountability measures, and we provide a score on the state accountability measures. And then we identify schools using both of those methods, and we'll talk more about that here in just a bit. Approach 1, which again, I'm focusing on the majority of my slides only because it's our understanding that that's what the board has requested information on. Approach 1 would be we submit a waiver to the statutory provision, and approach 1B would be we just say that we can't comply with that. And that 1B could happen after a waiver, or it could be a decision made before a waiver is sought. Okay, so anytime we make a decision in our lives, whether it's professional or in our families or at work, we generally try to measure out what's the risk versus the return on the given decision that we're trying to make. The risk for requesting a waiver, as you can see there, is pretty low. There's low consequences. It delays the time to where we have to get to a final decision with the federal government. The likelihood of receiving the waiver, of not receiving the waiver or having it denied would be medium to high. I spoke with our consultants from the Center for Assessment who work with states all across the country on waiver requests for various provisions in ESSA. I asked him if any state had requested a waiver on the 95% provision, and he said he's not aware of any of those. When we had conversations with the federal government, as we got feedback on our plan, we asked questions about this, and the individual we were speaking with indicated that the flexibility that's provided within ESSA, which we argued there's more flexibility, that's one of the selling points of ESSA, right? That didn't apply to this specific provision. So that's some of the feedback we've gotten, but it's unknown for sure whether it would be accepted or not. Some of the things that we would need to do are listed here, and I'll get into more details here shortly about what that looks like. But it would really rely on your staff to accomplish that. And the public comment portion would come after your decision of whether you want us to seek a waiver or not.
Okay, could you pause there for just a moment?
Yes.
Okay, Board Member Lisa Cummins.
Deputy Nielsen, could you tell me, was there a reason why that provision was not looked at as a flexibility?
Yeah, I don't know, other than to know that the individual that gave us the feedback, his argument was that all of the flexibility measures, which we believe there are more of those available now, apply to separate sections, and that this one it doesn't. And I think it goes back to, again, the philosophy of the 95% rule, and that is to try to make sure that no students are invisible to the accountability system.
So it sounds like a continuation of No Child Left Behind type mentality.
Yeah. So these are the steps. If we're directed to submit a waiver for this provision, is we would then prepare the waiver. Part of the work that this committee did, and it was a committee made up of your leadership, Patty Norman, myself, Tiffany Stanley, Brian Quisenberry. We involved Ann Michelle Neal, our accountability specialist, and then Rebecca Donaldson out of Title I, because her programs, and we'll talk about this in a minute, are impacted in a way that we think are very significant. We would post the waiver for public comment, and it's my understanding we can determine the length of that public comment, whether we go 30, 60, some other number of days. We would take the feedback that we get from the public comment, incorporate that into our official waiver request, and then submit that to the federal government, Department of Education, and then wait for a response. So within the waiver, there are some things they require us to put. One of those is the rationale for seeking the waiver. And these 3 things are some of the things that we talked about as a group that are possible rationale for that, things that we think should be considered. That given the fact that our state has an opt-out provision, and the number of students who are selecting to participate in that opt-out is increasing. We'll talk more about that here, but giving that context that by getting the waiver, we could more accurately identify schools that need improvement. Transparency, I think, is a core value of Utah education system. As a parent, I value that strongly, and as an educator, I thought that was important. As our accountability system becomes impaired either through high numbers of opt-outs or the way that we're required to calculate those opt-outs, it interferes with transparency. And I'll talk more about that here briefly too in a minute. Which then interferes with our parents' ability to make decisions based on the data that we provide them through our accountability system. This is the key part of the waiver, though. The states have to, when submitting a waiver, have to show how advancing student academic achievement would be enhanced through the waiver, through the federal government granting the waiver. So in that first bullet, we talk again about the way that they're forcing us to calculate non-participating students as non-proficient interferes and erodes confidence in our accountability system, would be one possible argument with them. And that the next one there would be focusing on how this problem then interferes with our ability to identify low-performing schools, which if we go back to Title I, that's how we redirect these funds, which are identified for and designed for the purpose of improving school achievement for some of our most significantly needed areas. And if we're not able to identify those schools appropriately, then we can misidentify where those funds go. And then denying schools and students groups that are the greatest academic need is, we believe, is direct opposition of the intent of several provisions of ESSA. So those would be some of our, some of the rationale and also some of the ways that we think being granted the waiver would enhance student academic achievement in Utah. Here's some additional considerations, again, that are possible if we're directed to submit a waiver. Again, in that first upper left-hand corner, we would identify that the unique challenges in Utah, there's only 5 states that allow parent opt-out on statewide accountability systems. And even within that, they're not all equal. We have some other state statute that prohibits the use of accountability measures and grades and other things that also contribute to that. So we would highlight those unique variables. We would share longitudinal data about our opt-out numbers and how that's increasing. And we'd also show how the opt-out is not equal across the board. There are certain student groups that are more likely to opt out, that are currently opting out at higher rates, and those are the students who are not low economic status and also are Caucasian. Part of our argument would be that those students being, those opt-out numbers for that population being higher, and then us counting those students as non-proficient, in some ways magnifies some of the inequities that, that we believe are happening. We'd also illustrate how some schools, some types of schools, our online schools, their opt-out rates are much higher than our traditional brick and mortar schools. Our charter schools that have been referenced a few times, their opt-out rates are higher. And so it affects these schools differently as well, which comes back to an equity issue. Down in the green, we'd articulate the value that we have in measuring student achievement and growth accurately. And the actions that you as a board have taken over time to try to deal with those issues in the manner that you do. We would reaffirm board support for identifying and supporting our lowest performing schools. And then the last one, I think we could make a case that it's a civil rights issue for students who are the most deserving of these additional resources to be, have those resources redirected in part because of a faulty mechanism for calculating those lowest performing schools. So those would be some of the considerations. There could be others that we could add to that. Implementation of this waiver request would allow the board, we would talk about this in the waiver as well, which is a required element, to better monitor, regularly evaluate effectiveness of schools. We would show how that's a high priority for us. We would show how the accountability system we believe would be more reliable and more meaningful if we're not forced to count non-participant students as non-proficient students. And then we would think this would lead to more accurate identification of gaps in achievement and help us focus our school improvement money in the right way. And then we had these other approaches. These last 2 slides are just a reminder. On the other approaches, non-compliance. There is a significant risk there. USB receives $123 million in all your title funds. There's a threat that those funds would be removed or withheld. The likelihood we put up there is unknown. The return there, you can see it might cause federal and state policymakers to reevaluate the overall program, and it would help us by avoiding creating 2 accountability systems, which can confuse our stakeholders in the field. To execute that, it would require support from both Utah's federal and state political leaders to try to leverage their resources and maybe even try to rally like-minded policymakers to push back against what appears to be a pretty firm boundary. And then the last slide is just, again, to maintain two parallel accountability systems. Disadvantages, it sends some conflicting messages. It is something we've done in the past in Utah. It's inconsistent. We have internal inefficiencies. Advantages, we're compliant. We put on here play by the rules. I call that compliance, and will not be a test state, right? And then to execute that, that's maybe the easiest of the options we've talked about to actually execute for your staff.
So in summation on that, the one thing that we want to make sure is that in asking for this waiver, all that we're asking for is for asking for a waiver from ESSA to have state control over accountability. So we're not debating anything about opt-out. What we're just doing is saying allow us to have our state accountability system.
So we await your direction as to what you'd like us to do in terms of this 95% requirement in ESSA, which of those approaches you'd like us to follow.
Okay. Superintendent Dixon.
The governor's office has been following this concern and approached us as staff on your behalf to see if we wanted them to come and talk to you about the governor's perspective on this. We felt like it was time for a board discussion before that occurred, but the governor's office reached out and wanted us to know that he's very in favor of the waiver and willing to stand at your readiness to assist, to meet with any congressional delegation, Department of Education. I see, Karen, you are here in the audience. I didn't see you. I apologize. So we appreciate that perspective and support, and Karen Peterson is here, I'm sure, that could add to that if you want her perspective.
So we have before us 3 decision points, and so we can take a motion or we can have further discussion on any of those. So Board Member Reby and then Vice Chair Ellis.
So I'm looking at our fingertip facts, which is awesome. And 6.7% of our budget comes from the federal government. We have our Caucasian population succeeding at a higher rate than our vulnerable populations. And our Caucasian members are opting out. I find this a little disconcerting that our most successful students are holding our least successful students almost hostage, for lack of a better word. And then I'm looking on the back here and I see that we spend $6,751 per pupil, where the national average is $11,454. I'm really concerned about this waiver. I wonder, as a state, if we can create a situation that would encourage our more successful students to realize the impact of what they're doing to our more vulnerable students. I am totally for getting out of the federal government if we want to start funding all these things, and if we can raise taxes and bring up those 6.7% of those funds, I'm totally fine with that. But this is shocking. This is scary to me as a person who works with low-income students, and I'm not willing to give up 6.7% of our budget, or $123 million. So the waiver scares me.
And I just want to clarify really quickly that seeking this waiver wouldn't automatically preclude us from any of that federal funding. It basically is just seeking a waiver to say we would like to go this direction, and then we would have those decision points later if they deny the waiver, if they say no. And so this particular decision at this point wouldn't affect any funding currently. So we'll go to Vice Chair Ellis and then Board Member Lear.
Thank you for all of your work on this. I appreciate it. And any path we take is not going to automatically prevent us from getting funding. And I'm a firm believer that if these services are as important as we feel they are, that we need to be petitioning our legislature to fund them instead of seeking approval from a federal government that constitutionally has no authority to be directing our education in our state. So I would like to make a motion that on this section of the ESSA plan that we submit 1B, and we say we are in control of our education system and we are going to follow our state laws, not federal laws. I mean, I'm giving too much detail. Basically, my motion is that we seek 1B, which is the no thank you option. Yes, thank you.
Can we go?
Okay, so we have a motion. Okay, so the motion was to go with 1B, which means to just be non-compliant to this. And we have a second. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Lear.
My question that I had initially dovetails with that. Do we know what other states are doing? Are any other states asking for this kind of a waiver? Do we know? Have they done it already? Have they had replies?
So I consulted with the assessment, or the Center for Assessment, who's one of our consultants that we employ to help us, and they work with states across the country. I asked him if he was aware of any other state that had requested a waiver on this provision of ESSA, and he said no, he was not aware of that. It's not uncommon for states to submit waiver requests on various provisions, but the 95% rule, he wasn't aware of any.
Thanks. And then a follow-up to that,
Okay.
please. Can I see the A and B slide again? And in response to that, and in response to the motion, my feeling is I want to ask for the waiver, but I don't see any need to poke the bear in the eye. I feel fine about asking for a waiver. Humbly, I'm really begging for the $100 and however million because I don't feel like we can get that much money from our legislature in an ongoing way without it being circumvented. So I absolutely support the idea of a waiver, but I see no need to be to call attention to ourselves.
Okay, I'm just going to make one clarification for those that are listening, that the motion was to be non-compliant to the 95% rule for participation in our assessment. So I just want to make that clarification. Board Member Hansen?
By doing this, we're putting all of our Title I money and our special ed money at risk, and so I cannot vote for this. I would prefer to do a waiver as well. Also, as far as the federal government goes, we pay a lot of money to the federal government, and so I have no problem with getting some of that money back.
Board Member Reeby?
If we don't receive this $123 million, how much does that diminish our WPU? And what are the other states that have an opt-out rule? And what is the WPU for those states that have the opt-out rule?
I'd have to defer to Deputy Superintendent Scott Jones.
How much would diminishing, not accepting this $123 million, how would that affect our WPU? To me, I'm seeing $4,725, but that might be wrong. So we're going from 6,000 to less than.
We'd have to look at it further. I can come back with you on detailed analysis on that. I'm not prepared to say, well, it'll affect the WPU or not. Ultimately, what the concern would be is that we could lose the Title I funding or the special education funding potentially. It's all part of the process, but I'll come back with some more details. I can do that probably today. I just need to get with Natalie and Jamie.
And what are the 5 states that also have an opt-out policy?
I am not sure about that. I don't know who has the.
We'll get that information shortly, right now.
Okay, because if the opt-out states have higher WPUs, then they can absorb some of this. But We cannot. We have the lowest WPU in the country.
Okay, there's a light on here. Is that Board Member Gravitt or Bolter? Board Member Bolter?
So right now, we don't even know what the federal government would do if we went the non-comply route. And so, as far as I know, we're the only state right now willing to stand up for our sovereignty and to say that you don't have a say in our education system. And the people that are closest to the children, which are our elected officials here in the state of Utah, we should be the ones deciding, not a far removed federal government. And how much more are we going to continue to comply with their requests and continue to play Mother May I with them for 8% of funding? And we don't even know whether or not they'll even withhold that funding, or whether or not our legislators will say, okay, we'll back you on this and we'll stand with you, which I'm hoping, and I think that they will, since they continually say that they stand on local control. Well, this is the biggest form of local control right now that we can do.
Okay, Board Member Reby?
We do have control over our education system. We create the standards. We have control over our system. They're asking for transparency, and they're asking us to do this for $123 million. It's not like we don't have control over the things that happen in our school. So when we say that we are being told what to do, we don't. We create our system here.
Okay, Vice Chair Ellis?
Thank you. I too don't really appreciate that we have to send our money to the federal government, and then in an effort to get back our hard-earned dollars, we have to get it back with strings attached. And I think that it is a disservice to the people in this entire country to take our students that are at the most at risk and hold the money from them for services that don't really have anything to do with them. So this opt-out rule, most of those students, I would feel should opt out, and if I were in there, I would encourage those students that would be receiving these funds to opt out of these tests, because they don't adequately measure the success of those students, or any student, in my opinion, personally, because there's so many different ways to determine what success means in this life. Anyway, so I would just urge you to think about this, and this isn't an assault on anyone in Title I status. This is more picking up the beacon, saying, you know what, we are ready to forge our own educational path, and I would make a point of making sure that nationally, if money was threatened to be withheld, that they would be held accountable for taking funding away from students that do not need to be having funding taken away from them.
Board Member Cummins?
I concur with Vice Chair Ellis and Bolter, Board Member Bolter. We have a significant opportunity here to lead the nation. We have a governor who's willing to back us. And I think, having talked to some legislators, I think we have the courage to fund that, to fund what's missing, put our money where our mouth is, pretty much. And I think the PR of a government not funding our Title I schools would be just as detrimental at the national level as, as us saying that we're not. And I don't advocate for pulling that money away. I am seeking for sovereignty to be able to direct how that money is spent and where it's most needed to provide the best outcomes for our students, and not be dictated to on how to do that.
Okay, Board Member Reby?
90% of our population takes these tests. Over 90% of our population takes these tests. That's a vote for these assessments and transparency, 90%.
Okay, we're going to allow Board Member.
You need to clarify.
Okay. I would like to just put one clarification out there is that Board Member Cummins mentioned that we have the governor's backing. The governor actually has backed the idea of a waiver, not the non-compliant route. And so there, and we'll go to Board Member Cannon for.
Okay, well, then I guess I would like to support the governor's idea of supporting a waiver and not the non-compliance. I go back to where we had a Republican administration that enacted No Child Left Behind. And no matter what you might think of No Child Left Behind, it started to disaggregate information. It started to show us that our Hispanic kids weren't graduating in Utah, that we weren't doing well with our minority students, and it gave us an opportunity to move forward and try to do better by these kids. And so now we go through all these opt-outs and everything, and I'm thinking, you know, what kids are we leaving behind? What kids may we not know need help? And what kids are at risk? As far as our state, I think we have a good idea of what they think about funding education, because for the last 30 years, Utah has been the most poorly funded education state in our nation. And so to say, well, let's lead out and let's call on them. I think that maybe philosophically they would say, great, but I certainly don't believe that financially they would step up and add $123 million of ongoing money to help our kids who are the neediest and the most at risk.
I would just like to give my comment as well as we talk about leading out, that the waiver is actually an opportunity to lead out as we open the question and we open the conversation with those at the Department of Education, whereas noncompliance almost shuts the door to that conversation, where this leads out, the first state in the nation to lead out on this conversation. And so I think the waiver is that opportunity to do so. And so we'll allow Board Member Hanson to go next. So.
I call the question.
Oh. Okay, so, and that's, we don't ask for discussion, is that correct? So it's just you ask for the, thank you for your patience as I figure this out. Okay, so all in favor of calling the question? Any opposed? Okay, so then the question before us is, the motion was to go with recommendation 1B, which was to not submit a waiver or to just be non-compliant on the 95% participation in our accountability or our assessment system. Did I state that correctly, Board Member Ellis? Okay. Okay. Okay.
But we
yep.
do submit it, so it's not just nothing.
So you're saying submitting in our ESSA plan that we will be non-compliant to the 95% requirement for student assessment. Okay. No, the question has been called. Okay, thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Testing?
Yes.
Okay, and this was the vote on the 95% waiver, right?
Correct. No.
Okay.
So Spencer, the motion is that we would not submit a waiver. It would be that we would just be non-compliant on that particular topic, which is 95% participation. Any questions of clarification on that motion? Okay. All in. So those that.
So I'm voting in favor of that.
Okay, so you're voting in favor of
Oh,
non-compliance.
excuse me. I'm voting no on this.
Okay, thank you, Spencer. Okay, so did you get all of those who voted in favor? Okay, so it was Board Member Bolter, Board Member Nielsen, Board Member Lisa Cummins, Board Member Wright, and Vice Chair Elisa Ellis. Okay, all opposed? And Spencer, were you opposed?
Yes, I'm opposed.
Okay. Okay, that motion fails. Okay. Okay, Board Member Hanson.
I move that we seek approach 1A, a waiver.
Okay, we have a motion which would be to seek a waiver on our ESSA plan for the 95% participation rate in our student assessment system. Okay, is there any discussion to that motion? Okay, then all in favor?
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? Okay, that motion passes. Okay. Okay, we have two other topics that were in regard to this plan, the accountability designation for alternative schools and the distribution of ineffective teachers. Does anybody want to take action on any of those items? Just as a reminder, this does need to be submitted in the next couple of weeks. So we.
But no pressure.
Yeah.
While you're
Yes.
pulling that up.
Okay, thank you. Board Member Ellis? Or Vice Chair Ellis, sorry.
Thank you. While you guys are preparing, I just wanted to ask a question on some of these policies that are being put in place, especially in the alternative accountability system. I think they're very good, thoughtful approaches that need to be implemented. The part I struggle with is the fact that we're doing this to be compliant with the federal government. And so I would ask that these aren't just simply approached in this document, but that these systems that we're coming up with be placed into our governance structure instead of just writing it to put in a request to the federal government, because these are things that need to be happening to help these students show that they find success in these ways and not just based on what we tell them to do by law.
Okay, Board Member Hanson.
I move that we adopt, we want to pass this, right? Have it put in the ESSA, this proposed ESSA response on accountability.
Both issues on both.
Okay.
Do we want to do them one at a time, or do you want to do it all at once? Can we do it all at once, or do you want to split it?
If you would like to make that motion, you can.
Okay, so let's do the one on the teachers as well at the same time. Okay. So those two responses that have been presented to us on accountability and the teachers.
Okay, that's, a motion is to forward the recommendations from staff of our accountability, all schools participating in accountability, as well as our equitable distribution of effective educators. Is there any discussion to that motion? Board Member Lear?
I'm comfortable with the teacher response. And I'm trying to think how to say this. I'm comfortable with both of them for purposes of ESSA. I am not comfortable, and I'm comfortable with the teacher response across the board. I think that if we're going to institutionalize the definition of alternative schools, or the way that alternative schools are to be addressed, that it needs further discussion, and it also needs to be in a board rule so that the schools have a black and white explanation of when they can be an alternative school and when they can't. And I don't think writing it for purposes of ESSA appropriately gives notice to all those who might be involved.
And thank you for bringing that up, Board Member Lear. And just a reminder that this motion wouldn't include all of those things, that the recommendations that this committee brought forward include just what you mentioned, going forward with this work and creating those definitions.
So just for purposes of ESSA, is that
So,
what you're
yeah, so if the purposes of ESSA were to say that this work, we are engaged in this work and that all schools will be a part of our accountability system under this way, and that we will go forward with the work of identifying what an alternative school is.
Then I'm comfortable with that. I don't want to agree wholeheartedly with what the committee has decided without further discussion.
Okay, so we have Vice Chair Ellis. Oh, sorry. Board Member
My
Cannon.
question just goes to the equitable distribution of effective educators. There was a caveat put on there, and I'm wondering if it is included in this motion then, that USBE will adopt rules requiring charters to report numbers of ineffective teachers, because apparently we haven't done that. Would that be included in this motion? That's my question.
So that, I believe, if I understood the presentation correctly, that is something similar to the work on educator or accountability would be that would be a discussion going forward on the how to define the policy that would govern that, if I understood correctly, the presentation.
Sure, we move forward with both those things.
Assistant Superintendent, sorry, I'm trying to get the title right. Dinah Sudreth. Yes, thank you.
So I just got a promotion. That's great.
I'm sorry.
Everybody today. Promotions all around.
Director.
The way that we wrote it would be that we would seek that the board would seek the passage of the rule. So I think it does tie your hands a little bit the way that it's written, because the implication would be that such a rule would be put in place. I could write it differently, but that is the way it's currently written.
Okay. Board Member or Vice Chair Ellis.
Thank you. And I wanted to thank Board Member Lear for bringing up this concern, because I think this is a very valid concern, because we have processes in place to make sure that the public has adequate time to comment. And then when we create a rule, we send it to the Administrative Rules Committee, and there's a process where public can come and give a hearing. And in essence, by turning in this, we're saying these are the things that we're going to do. And that bypasses that entire public structure put into place. And so it may be appropriate that we have to reword it to say, this is where we are right now. We may look at it in the future, but we can't guarantee that's the direction that we'll go, because there's a process that's in place. And so I feel uncomfortable saying that this is the direction we're moving when it hasn't been vetted through that public process. And it's all in an effort to meet a guideline by the federal government for less than 7% of our funding. I mean, I could go on, and this is where the control mechanism that a lot of us are concerned about comes from, is we end up making sweeping policy changes trying to get funding from an entity that only has a small portion of our funding even at bay.
Okay. Board Member Lisa Cummins.
And I would also like to include with that, that we have an appeals process, which we're going to discuss in the next meeting, correct? And that maybe a waiver pathway be spoken about or written about, so that if an LEA chooses not to be held accountable to the state accountability system or to the federal accountability system, that there's a way to opt out of that system.
Board Member Lear.
I think the wording to the government, to the feds, can be a lot more nuanced. I don't think we need to say we are doing this. I think we can say we're working toward a solution that will put us in the right place with our administrative rulemaking and whatever. And I'm sure you folks can figure out that wording. But while I do want to say whatever we have to say that's reasonably truthful to get this money, I am not I am not okay about saying that I am completely satisfied with our conclusion on alternative schools. So I think that if you can say that consistent with the requirements to submit this proposal, then I'm on board. If not, I will need to have more discussion about what we say. But as I read it, and as I heard Janet read it, I think that we can say we're working in this direction, but we have our own internal statewide procedures that have to be met, i.e. rulemaking.
Okay, Director Sedgwick.
So I looked up to see exactly how we wrote it, and I think that this is doing what you're asking. Therefore, USBE will consider requiring charter schools to report the numbers of ineffective teachers beginning in spring 2018. So the word consider is there.
Yes, go ahead.
So, like I said, we tried to make the language in the proposed response very broad so that we would have the opportunity to continue this work and respond to all the other questions that have come up. So if you look at the middle of that second sentence, it says, if identified for improvement, those schools that didn't meet the minimum size on all indicators, if identified for improvement, will be reviewed on an individual basis. So it's very broad. Of course, it could be, we're happy to wordsmith, but that's the crux of the response, is that if they're identified, we're going to keep looking. And so as the committee at your direction continues to work, we could bring information to you that through board rule, then you could determine exactly what the second look was, and in which cases, to Vice Chair Ellis's comment, in which cases that look happens. Does that respond to your question, Board Member Lear?
Thank you, yes.
Okay, Board Member Hanson.
So to all of you, so it doesn't say anywhere in here that we are definitely going to write a rule, because that seems to be the issue. It doesn't say that anywhere. It's more nuanced than that, right? Okay, so I think I'm good.
Okay, if there are no further questions, all in favor? Should I restate the motion, Lorraine? All in favor of approving the recommendations for our ESSA plan on accountability and distribution of effective teachers, equitable distribution of effective teachers? All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Any opposed? Okay, that motion passes. I did want to bring up one item of clarification on the prior motion, and somebody can help me how to make this clarification, but part of submitting the waiver is sending it out for a 30-day public review. Did that need to be included in our motion? Staff can clarify that for us.
I don't believe it does, because it's one of the requirements. So once you've requested that we create the waiver, then we'll just execute the process to complete that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay. Next item on our agenda is a break.